Finally, it is war time. The fourth Shinobi War to be specific. But before I dive into the review for this week, I regretfully need to announce something. As many of you might have noticed or saw either on Twitter or as the pinned comment in last week's video, I revealed that I had in fact been spoiled on one significant aspect of the story, that being I now know who Madara really is. Despite using the same tactics I had been using with One Piece, muting words on various social media, as it happened, the spoilers came by way of a much more malicious source. During the flame war on Twitter last week regarding the great Sakura debate, someone went out of their way to spell names with numbers to slip through my muted words intentionally in an effort to specifically spoil me. Now, I want this experience to be as authentic as I possibly can, so I felt it necessary to be transparent about this. I'm sorry if this has dampened anyone's excitement for the rest of this series and my reactions, but I'll be taking more extreme measures to avoid more instances like this in the future. That said, I am still very excited to see how the rest of the story pans out and intend on sharing my thoughts on Obito's reveal once it does prop up in the story. Oftentimes, it's the hows and whys that are the most interesting narratively anyway, and so, with that somewhat somber disclaimer out of the way, it's time to dive into something a little more action-packed and fun. As I said in the beginning, this video is about war. So let's get to it. Off the back of my last video, I'm picking things up again right as Naruto saves Sakura from her second near-death experience courtesy of Sasuke, which leads to a surprisingly novel experience in the series. There is a standoff, yes, but there's, relatively speaking, very little action, with only one blow being exchanged between the two warriors. And the interesting part of this scene doesn't come from the action, but instead through the thoughts and words shared.
Yeah, but first a quick word from our sponsor.
Thank you so much to Athletic Greens for sponsoring today's video. They were kind enough to send across their wonderful comprehensive all-in-one greens powder called AG1 by Athletic Greens. For me, this is a year all about restoring the active lifestyle I largely lost during the past few years of madness in the world. I have plans to travel to the US this year and also run a marathon. There's a lot to do that requires me to feel as healthy as possible, so joining up with Athletic Greens was a real no-brainer. Their AG1 powder makes keeping up with the nutrition super simple. No longer do you need to keep up with a whole bunch of different tablets to maintain your health. 75 vitamins, minerals, whole food source superfoods, probiotics, and adaptogens, that's a mouthful. All of this contained within one single daily serving. It's totally brainless and has gone a long way in not only helping me feel a boost in energy throughout the day, but has also helped me bounce back quicker from my daily workouts. If this sounds good, then you'll be glad to hear Athletic Greens have also been kind enough to offer you guys a whole year's free supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. For me, one of the best aspects is that AG1 is super simple to use. You just mix one scoop with water or your favorite smoothie or juice of choice, shake it up, and you're good to go. It's got a fairly earthy taste with a sweet edge, the intensity of which is really easy to control based on how much liquid you use and of what type, which is great for someone like me who's always a bit skeptical of healthy looking green things. So if that sounds good to you, be sure to click the link in the description now to get your year's supply of vitamin D3K2 and 5 travel packs for free with your first purchase. AG1 provides your body with everything it needs for optimal performance every single day. This is a game changer for supporting your immune system, and I can't recommend it enough. Naruto sees Sasuke as a friend and understands the nuance of his situation. He's also capable of empathizing with his circumstances, even going as far as to imagine a scenario where he could have turned out exactly the same as Sasuke. Lost and vengeful. There's a nice callback to their last major conflict with Naruto himself citing that they are both high-level shinobi now, meaning they should be able to read each other's thoughts apparently. Further emphasizing this sense in Sasuke that Naruto does in fact understand why he is the way that he is and drags to the forefront Sasuke's mistakes for him, only for Sasuke to double down on his path moments afterwards by requesting he receive his brother's eyes because he is now losing his vision. And speaking of which, perhaps down the road this choice could act as a physical embodiment of finally getting to see the world from his brother's perspective, slowly coming around to his way of seeing things both literally and metaphorically. In other words, there might be a chance for some nice, albeit slightly on the nose, symbolism. But I digress. The scene itself between Sasuke and Naruto exchanging words has some really nice callbacks to their respective pasts as they launch towards each other with their respective signature techniques, the Chidori and the Rasengan. It's quite tense, and despite it being for the most part a little teaser or prelude to what will no doubt be a massive conflict later on in the story, I thought the dialogue and themes presented here were both entertaining and effective in what they were trying to achieve. And before I move on, I want to touch on what might be a minor visual cue, but it might also be my favorite visual indicator during the entire entire confrontation that spoke to how serious and all in, really, Naruto was during this meeting with Sasuke. Prior to stepping forward to confront him, both physically and verbally, Naruto had created 2 other clones. This could have created the perfect situation for him to hedge his bets and bluff by keeping his true self back while sending out a clone to carry out that same message. You know, for safety. However, and this speaks to what he said to Sakura about authenticity and being true to oneself, he didn't do that. As made evident by those 2 clones vanishing the moment Sasuke leaves, revealing that the real Naruto was in fact the one in front of him all along before passing out. In that moment, he really put everything on the line, extending a friendly smile and genuine hand in order to potentially save his friend, earnestly trying to do so. That's a powerful statement, and it's communicated without words brilliantly in a way only Naruto the character can. It's a brilliant part of this scene that honestly was quite understated, I thought. Switching gears now to something completely different, Killer Bee returns to his village with his brother in tow, the Raikage. Since defeating Kisame, he's been keeping his sword as a, quote, spoil of war, but oh wait! Kisame is alive. This legitimately caught me off guard. I genuinely thought he was dead considering the direction the story was going. It made sense to me at the time that the cast would start to dwindle down some. However, my estimation was entirely incorrect. Instead, we're not only not killing off Kisame, but we're reincorporating him back into the story along with Kabuto, with a brand new snake-like design. And speaking of Kabuto, hello! I'm glad Orochimaru's presence is still being felt in this story since his absorption somewhat. So much time had been spent on him and his desires as a character. Furthermore, he offered a really interesting third position in the Akatsuki vs Shinobi war that's now looming on the horizon. And thankfully, Kabuto can act as the replacement for that ideology in many respects. With his desires not necessarily interfering with the Akatsuki, the alliance between the two was an interesting one for sure. And catching back up with the Konoha folks that Sakura knocked out, I think it's interesting watching Karen remark on what she feels when looking at Naruto compared to when she looked at Sasuke, remarking that he's the exact opposite of him, bright and warm. But what I really liked about this was what it was foreshadowing. For moments after she remarks on his brightness and warmth, she comes right out and remarks on what darkness lies beneath, the 9-tailed fox spirit. I like this in retrospect as it really helps to set up and build up a challenge Naruto eventually has to face, mastering this darkness he possesses deep down. And speaking of that darkness, right off the back of Sasuke's successful eye surgery, transplant, or whatever you want to call it, we witness an encounter between Naruto and the Toad spirits. This largely deals with the Elder Toad examining Naruto's destiny for any signs of progression towards a favorable goal. In it, he sees 2 entities in Naruto's future. The Toad Elder sees an octopus taking the form of a mentor, of which, while reading, I had a few working theories as to what that 8-limbed entity might manifest as. Theory number 1. Octopuses are famous for their 8 limbs which look like tails, and so my first thought is that this could easily point to Naruto being mentored by Killer Bee and his 8-tailed spirit. This makes sense as he would be able to teach him to control the 9 tails like he did with his 8 as established earlier in the story. This one happened to be correct. Theory number 2 was, maybe the octopus and its 8 limbs are a misdirect and Naruto is actually going to fight against or learn from Kabuto and his mini snakes, which could take the form of 8 snakes, who knows. This was a long shot and I knew it. And finally, my third theory was, maybe the octopus is a metaphor for a beast composed of 8 individuals. Maybe this will result in Naruto working with Killer Bee and 7 others to complete his training. But this again was a long shot in my eyes. The second and final prophecy interpreted by the Toad spoke of someone whose power lies in his eyes, which Naruto confidently alludes to Sasuke matching that description. And I mean, it does. But now that Naruto, and effectively Kishimoto, has pointed it out, it makes me question whether or not it is going to be Sasuke. Either way, I'm excited by the prospects of this. I love that this training Naruto has to undergo also forces him to focus on what makes him different from Sasuke. That his training is only possible because he represents the ideological opposite to Sasuke's hatred. One cannot master what Naruto is setting out to do by embracing hate, but in fact, suppressing and overcoming it. It's perfect. And the means with which he does it is also great. Right now, Naruto has to overcome his internal demons to even qualify for the training under Killer Bee. And upon stepping up to this preliminary challenge, Naruto realizes what's being asked of him. The actual manifestation of his anger, resentment, and hatred stands before him. The chakra and world that Naruto inhabits is great for these obvious visual metaphors, and oftentimes when shows have interesting worlds and settings like this that lend a lot to their stories, they rest on the laurels of those advantages while not staying true to the characters. In this, however, the manifestation of Naruto's hatred is perfectly in keeping with his character. Earlier in the arc, as well as other times in this series, Naruto's been apprehensive to indulge or fully embrace the adulation he's been receiving since becoming the hero of Konoha, and when faced with his inner hatred, we learn that this stems from a lack of trust in them and himself. A lack of trust because he doesn't fully believe in himself being worthy of this praise. And there's something beautiful about that once he overcomes it, not through action, but instead through self-acceptance. And this early training material is full of moments very true to Naruto's character. He's lighthearted in the face of uncertainty, and when offered the chance to use a clone to hedge his bets, he unflinchingly refuses to use it, citing that he's going to trust himself. Speaking again to that very aspect present in the last encounter with Sasuke that I loved so much.
Yo, 相変わらず目つき悪いな。
貴様、本当のお前はどこに行った？
The struggle between Naruto and the Nine-Tailed Fox Spirit is, for all intents and purposes, one of the best moments for me in the entire series. Not just for its thematic resonance with me or even how well it's drawn. There's tons to love and appreciate about this sequence and struggle for Naruto, with his clear reliance on every signature move he's learned across the series, from the clone technique, to the Rasengan, to even the Sage mode itself. All of which are manifestations and results derived from those that have helped and loved him in the past, particularly with the Sage mode. And when he uses that, I actually got chills. All of this is fantastic. However, for me, the best part of this scene came from how it ended up making me feel.
Naruto.
At the beginning of every volume, Kishimoto writes a short paragraph describing either the development of this particular volume or whatever might have been on his mind at the time of writing it. For volume 53, he wrote this: "When the time came to put together the plot for Naruto volume 53, I consulted my wife. And this is what resulted. Stories about mother." And if I'm being completely honest, I really felt that warm, authentic motherly influence all over these chapters when Naruto contends with his inner demons. The fact that his mother and father were both set up by prior seals to appear at certain key moments in his life, I thought was a brilliant touch. There's a scene much later on where Iruka's father says to him, "It's the parents' duty to protect their children." And protect their child, Kushina and Minato most definitely did and continue to do. Culminating with the events detailed from chapter 500 onwards, entitled The Birth of Naruto. This is the best part of this story I've read. I don't think I've ever been more captivated by this series before. The sense of occasion, spectacle, and profound drama coats each and every page, enticing me to read further. The precise and careful steps taken by Madara to exact his revenge on Konoha by unleashing the Nine-Tailed Fox Spirit. The sheer scale of the occasion, knowing what we do now about what happens. All the while we watch as Naruto's mom and dad do everything in their power to hang on long enough to save him and his village. It's a stunning series of chapters that I actually found myself going back over to read before writing this very section of the video. It's just so well handled, with the small cameos from Kakashi and Guy, with Iruka being courageous even as early as then. We get to see the third Hokage, as well as a host of other villagers and shinobi, some familiar and others formerly slain. But beyond anything else, the real star of this show is the sense of paternal responsibility, intense love for, and belief in their first and only child, Naruto. I love how Minato is so level-headed, calm, and talented, always looking to put the needs of his family and others ahead of his own, and I adore how chaotic and courageous Kushina is when trying to help her husband and child. I can see clear as day where all of Naruto's best traits came from. The drama and stakes rise higher and higher until they both realize that there's only one way of dealing with this monster. And when they come to that conclusion, Naruto's father exclaims, "Let's believe in this child. He is our son after all." For a series like Naruto, I don't think there could have been a more fitting line than this right here. A child that has suffered from a feeling of inadequacy because he felt no one ever believed in him, because no one ever loved him, ended up in that situation for quite the opposite reason. Because those that loved him more than anything else in the world were willing to lay everything they had on the line to save him. to believe in his future and what he can bring to the world. It's such a brilliant line that speaks to the 500 chapters that came before it. And then there's the final moments of the volume, where Kushina and Minato, moments before their respective deaths, unpack everything they wish they could tell their son before they pass on. And to say that I wept in these fleeting moments would be an understatement. This utterly destroyed me, and I cannot express just how much I adored this scene today. And it was all down to how authentic it felt. Remaining true to the mission statement at the beginning of this volume, I can absolutely tell that Kishimoto and his wife collaborated on the dialogue and direction of these scenes. Kushina had so much to say. She was so loving and maternal, both in a traditional sense and in a progressive one at times. All the while, Minato remained steadfast, kind, and supportive all the way to the bitter end. It's fantastically believable and entrancing in the most tragic and beautiful of ways. Easily the most emotional this series has made me, hands down, no exceptions. With the final results being a newly unlocked form, the likes of which is more aesthetically pleasing to me than any other design I've yet seen produced from Naruto or Kishimoto for the rest of this series. It looks powerful, transcendent, and appropriately angelic, given what Naruto has gone through to achieve it. It looks perfectly suited to Naruto himself, as Karen would put it, bright and warm. Guy versus Kisame. So this fight scene boasts one of the few moments that actually made me laugh out loud while reading a manga. Having already established what happened at the Waterfall of Truth through Naruto's fight with himself, to contrast that with Kisame crashing through it, leading to Guy believing that Kisame's weird, spiky, crazy form was his true self, gave me a good chuckle in all honesty. And furthermore, I was elated that Guy was now back in the fold, actively participating in the story. It's been way too long, and I hope we get to see more of Rock Lee and him too. Those characters are way too good not to be used more than they currently are. And in all seriousness, this fight vindicates that desire because holy fucking shit, this was incredible. Throughout this series, Kisame has been a cockroach. Not in the sense that he's an irritating insect, but more so that he just won't die or go away. And being incredibly powerful as he is, he's always been a large issue whenever he's propped up in the story. Armed with abilities that absorb chakra, I honestly couldn't think of a better opponent to absolutely body him like Guy did right here. The years of tireless practice in perfecting an area of fighting that's been somewhat neglected in modern times, taijutsu, something that could have been seen as a weakness in some other occasion, is the very reason he was able to overcome Kisame in this moment. There's no chakra use at all, he's just so powerful his fists change the pressure in the air enough to create this monstrosity. Watching Kisame try and fail to secure any of his chakra in his usual way, it's mind-bendingly cool to watch, and when Kisame tries to move even an inch afterwards, Guy pounces on him, effortlessly pinning him to the ground yet again. For an individual who's more flamboyant and lighthearted than most, it serves his character and indeed this scene well for him to be so serious during this encounter. It's a great contrast, what a tussle, so damn cool. Also, I'm not gonna lie, there are times when I'm reading this story that I wished it was more like Guy and Rock Lee's story. They need their own spin-off manga or something because I would read that in a heartbeat. I just love their designs and characters. They're just so dorky while also looking effortlessly badass when drawn a certain way. That's a really tough balance to strike with the design, and they're barely used at all. The ending, however, of this encounter with Kisame is actually kinda nice, but in a troubling sort of way, of course. Trying to get intel from Kisame while he's down, Kisame elects to off himself instead of relinquishing said information. And I like this really only because we get a short glimpse into his past and his first introduction to Itachi way back when. I will however say that I would have liked his backstory to be established a little earlier in the story than it was right now. Us being filled in on the details of his key life thematic moments mere seconds before his death feels a tiny bit rushed, and I feel cheapens the overall character. He's a brilliant character. This sort of felt like Kishimoto was a kid in class doing his homework right before it started, though I suppose that's a bit severe. We've known Kisame for quite some time, and I still very much enjoyed this bit of introspection it offered us for Itachi, and indeed how it influenced Kisame's judgment. I especially liked the line Itachi utters about death, quote, "No matter who you are, you do not know what kind of human you are until the very end," which speaks wonderfully to both Itachi and indeed Kisame's death at this moment. I really liked this inclusion.
あなたは闇光のない世界では花は枯れるしかない
I And right off the back of Kisame, we get this mammoth of a battle between Conan and Uchiha Madara, during which his mask starts to break off from her incredible attack and will to defeat him. I didn't see this battle in the anime, but in the manga, the scale and scope of Kishimoto's drawings really sold me on the magnitude of this encounter. Conan is standing up for an ideal instilled in her by Naruto earlier in the story, hopeful that the future Nagato yearned for would eventually become a reality. It's clear that Obito, or Madara in this instance, is single-minded in his approach, referring to Nagato initially not by name, but instead by his utility, the Rinnegan. And watching Conan shroud him in her bombs, leaving him with a destroyed mask and a missing arm, felt massively satisfying and surprising. It seems, having come from a group that believed in Yahiko or Nagato being the bridge to peace, they now have only one hope left: Naruto. And really, I think that's a nice build-up towards the climax. There's a really sweet little sign-off too to these characters using their time spent with Jiraiya. But again, I kind of wish this lesson they shared wasn't established for the purposes of this exit to the story. I still think it's massively resonant, but I think it could have been made a lot more effective if it had been a callback to an element of their training we had already been exposed to during their time with Jiraiya. But that's honestly just a small gripe. And hey look, Madara has a swanky new mask. Right at this moment, Naruto thinks he's on a mission to count the amount of balls on these animals, all the while not Deidara and Kabuto try to reach and capture him, while flying on a giant clay bird, which is in and of itself flying to an island that is also not an island but a massive turtle. Do I have that right? This story is so weird and I love it in the best of ways. At this point, the story is escalating much faster than I expected it to, which is brilliant from a pacing standpoint, and I love the atmosphere and characters that are being brought to the forefront of this arc too. Funnily enough, Kishimoto wrote at the beginning of volume 55 that he had to go back and reference his older work because this upcoming section involves so many past characters, apparently he just forgot about their specs. And don't worry, Kishimoto, so did I. Probably the most significant actions that occurred during this encounter were that the old Kage guy that looks a little like the inspiration for Gran Torino from My Hero Academia fought against Deidara, and of course the capture of Yamato by Kabuto. I think the most interesting part of this for me was how calculated and measured Kabuto's judgment seems to be in this instance. He's not going to overextend himself at all, and due to that he's managed to make off with Yamato, a massively powerful shinobi and ally to Naruto, all in an effort to effectively fuel Madara's army. And I guess that means it's time for war. Gaara's speech. One thing I will say about this from the outset, as it's as good a time as any to say it, Gaara's role in the story ever since the time skip has been diminished so significantly that it almost feels like an injustice. Similar to how I've expressed myself concerning Guy and Rock Lee, Gaara's another one of those characters I felt could have offered so much more to the story, having been yet another, albeit much more simple, analog to Sasuke given the journey he's on right now. I was prepared going into the time skip for Gaara to fulfill a specific role. While not as prominent as Naruto and Sasuke, I figured given his standing in the story at the time that he would have been kept involved in the rat race, so to speak. With that said, leading up to this point, I haven't been entirely upset with his utility in the tale altogether. He does provide an interesting bit of commentary concerning his view on the old guard versus the next generation, and I do like how he empathizes from time to time on the actions of different characters he relates to on a deeper level. Furthermore, I think placing him into a leader's role is a really interesting idea, and while I am happy with what he offers the story, I think he's still being criminally underutilized. And I'd even go as far as to say that I feel like there have been some new characters introduced in this second half of the story, fulfilling roles that he could have otherwise been occupying at this moment, but that's just my opinion. As we're introduced to both the Shinobi and the Akatsuki forces, there's a great contrast established. While we look at the folks fighting on behalf of Shinobi against the Akatsuki, we see numerous faces, some familiar, some unfamiliar, all with a strong sense of character, perspective, and experience, or lack thereof. Every one of them voices their concerns, speculations, and thoughts to us as we cycle through each regiment. However, with the Akatsuki, there's nothing but darkness and silence. Like an army of zombies totally void of life are bracing themselves for an imminent attack. Awaiting the orders of their leader Madara, it's quite tense and atmospheric if I'm being perfectly honest. Gaara's speech is the best thing his character has done since Naruto saved him so long ago. And while I have my grievances with how this character has been treated since, this scene still speaks to the aspects of the character that I adored back in the beginning and indeed still do right now. The differences that make up this fighting unit, this army when compared to the forces of the Akatsuki, is that of life. They aren't resurrected beings, they aren't zombies, they have one life and they have free will. These are the very things that they are fighting against the Akatsuki for. However, they are also something that at this moment are standing in their respective ways. For many years, the shared histories of these villages, Mist, Cloud, Sandstone, Leaf, etc., have been a source of pain and hatred for one another. But this is where Gaara has a chance to utilize his unique history to act as the great unifier in many respects. And in quite spectacular fashion too, might I add. I was only sitting here reading the speech in the manga and it still gave me chills. Again, he totally empathizes with the respective points of view and even offers himself up to the chopping block once this is all over, but also outlines that today they need to unify using their shared experience with the Akatsuki, to understand that this is much larger than each of them and their individual feelings right now, and serves to highlight that following hatred is a recipe for disaster, a lesson Naruto taught him. And for Naruto, their families, and their homes, they must fight this day. It's a spectacular speech that again speaks to the themes of this character and indeed to handing over responsibility to the next generation to try and make amends for the mistakes of the past. Like I mentioned in the past, with regards to Naruto's motivation and conviction, as well as what's highlighted when comparing these two armies, a driving force of many of these conflicts is that of dealing with reality. And right here in this battle, we see just that. We watch as Sai confronts a version of his brother whom he loves. We watch as Sasori learns to understand that the so-called true self he now believes he is nothing more than a marionette controlled and conjured by someone else. All of these are terrific instances that speak to the ideology that makes for the real battleground that this all is taking place on, with a really nice touch being that of their termination, not by offense, but instead by convincing them to join reality instead of a fantasy. A nice ruffle in the story from Kishimoto, I thought. And if the impending battle wasn't tense enough, the training Naruto's undergoing right now might yield my new favorite technique in the series. So, this Biju Chakra Fire Spirit mode he's got right now is surprisingly similar mechanically to that of the Kaioken. Well, at least from what it offers the story in some important respects. Similar to the Kaioken, if Goku were to rely too heavily on it, it would cease being a tool and instead become an instrument for his demise, as seen during the Saiyan saga. However, with Naruto having successfully alphaed the Nine-Tailed Spirit, he now has access to the Fox's chakra reserves, an important and brilliant addition to his repertoire. However, without having tamed the fox, Naruto now runs a very large risk. If he relies too heavily on the fox spirit's chakra energy, the fox too can steal Naruto's chakra. And if that supply reaches zero, that being Naruto's chakra energy, then there's no more Naruto. And to add more weight to this issue, if he uses the clone technique, it expedites that same process, which not only means a significantly important technique fundamental to much of his arsenal has now been compromised, but he also can't lean as heavily on it to speed up his training. But in typical Naruto fashion, this isn't going to slow the young man down, but I honestly have no idea where this will lead him. My hope is somewhere really cool. I'm going to stop here for now. Next time I cover Naruto, I will be covering all the upcoming battles, and I hope I'll see you there. If you want more content like this, consider subscribing. It makes a massive difference to myself and my team, and it only takes 2 seconds of your time. And hey, you can always undo it later if you want. With all of that said, I hope you have a terrific day. I've been Totally Not Mark, and thank you all so much for watching.